We are very grateful to David Picker Kille for stepping in this evening at fairly short notice because the lecture that was originally penciled in has had to be postponed. And we realize that in the middle of the semester, it's not easy for David to put everything together this evening. We may find it's a little shorter than some of our lectures have been, but we're very much looking forward to it, looking forward to what he has to say. And David is joining us all the way from the States this evening, from Florida. Now, some of you will have come across David Picker Kille before because, of course, he is one of our authors from volume 1 of Itinerant. And he studies at the University of the Florida State University, where he's currently doing a PhD in the Department of Classics, with particular specialization in Roman archaeology and vehicles and roadways. And I suspect he has a particular specialization, we may find out later, in ruts. You will note that we are entitled this evening Between the Rut and the Hard Place. And I imagine some of this is building on his previous publications, one of which in 2016 was entitled Stuck in a Rut, Analysis of the Gallo-Roman Road in Burgundy, and another one, Radar in Orbitae Est, an archaeology of wheel ruts in the Roman Western Mediterranean and Europe. So to speak of ruts and Roman roads, I don't think we could have anybody better than David Picker Kille. So I'm going to ask David.
Sorry, Rob, you appear to have muted yourself at the very end of that sentence.
Right, I didn't mean to mute myself. So over to you now, David. You
Okay.
take it from here.
Yes, all right. Well, thank you very much, Rob. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was more than happy to take this up last minute, but just, I guess, disclosure that I apologize in advance if there are any glitches in the nature of the presentation. I double checked it. It should all go smoothly, but just a warning, I suppose. And I guess, thank you again for having me. And I guess with that said, let me see if I can't share the screen properly. Oh, okay, so I need to PowerPoint. Okay, and now, if I could just get a, hold on, somebody just send a message just to make sure that that can be seen, just because of the way.
Yes, we can see that. Maybe.
Perfect, excellent. All right, so I will get started. All right. All right. Ooh, that's in the way. Okay. From the extensive, albeit now largely obsolete, 17th century work of Nicolas Bergier to modern GIS-based approaches, and from the proceeding of 19th century local antiquarian societies to now large public-facing academic organizations such as the RRA, the historiography of the study of Roman roads is arguably as intriguing as the study of ancient roads themselves. Despite the evolution, growth, and many changes that the study of Roman roads has undergone throughout the centuries, especially the last decades, however, significant areas of our understanding of the construction, use, and management of roadways during the Roman period continue to rest upon problematic, monolithic, and outdated preconceptions. In some cases, relevant archaeological evidence is often molded to fit pre-existing narratives of Roman roads, and in others, it is simply ignored. The following discussion, in which we reconsider, in light of more recent archaeological evidence and research, the remains of a segment of an ancient road in Burgundy, France, that was the subject of my 2016 undergraduate thesis, provides an excellent case study in how dismantling preconceived assumptions about roadways and travel in antiquity allow us to raise several new and important questions that are sure to lead to insightful discoveries and conclusions across the wider field of Roman archaeology. Okay. Before looking at the road itself, however, let us review the chronology of Roman activity in the wider region in order to contextualize our findings with relevant historical events and activities. Between 58 and 50 BCE, Julius Caesar successfully conquers Gaul, setting the stage for the establishment of the Roman provinces of Gallia. In 43 BCE, possibly inspired by Caesar's assassination and the ensuing civil war, the native Allobroges of Vienna expel Roman colonists. In response, the provincial governor, Lucius Munatius Plancus, resettles the refugees a few miles upstream the Rhone, at its confluence with the Saône River at the colony of Lugdunum, or modern-day Lyon. After emerging victorious from the Civil War, marking the beginning of the Roman Empire, or Roman Principate in 27 BCE, Octavian, i.e. Augustus, the first emperor, sends his general and close friend, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, to properly reorganize Gaul into a Roman province. One of the defining products of Agrippa's work, according to the ancient historian and geographer Strabo, was the four major routes extending from out of Lugdunum, together nowadays known as the Via Agrippa, which may have actually been started a decade earlier. Lugdunum's centrality, the confluence of rivers and four major highways, either solidified the intentionality of or ultimately effectuated the city's de facto status as the capital of Gallia for the next several centuries. Our discussion here will largely focus on the central part of what is known as the ocean route. Okay. In truth, most scholarship agrees that much of the road network that Strabo attributes to Agrippa more likely reflects the Roman adoption and renovation of pre-existing Gallic roads over the course of the century after the start of the Principate. Indeed, the ocean route passes through two large pre-Roman Latinian settlements, Chalon-sur-Saône, or Roman Cabionum, of the Aedui, and Sens, Roman Agendicum, of the eponymous Senones tribe, and passes near the large Gallic oppidum of Bibracte on Mont Bouvray. That said, the ocean route is the only one, according to recent archaeological research, that can be likely attributed to the early Augustan period, if not earlier, and thus possibly to Agrippa himself, i.e. no later than 25 to 10 BCE. At some point during the reign of Augustus, the fortress of Bibracte was relocated or replaced by the city of Augustodunum, a few kilometers to the east, which would serve as the regional capital for the next several centuries, and for which the ocean route serves as the Cardo Maximus as it passes through. The ongoing excavations over the past decade of the extramural areas of the city have refined the city's foundation date to sometime between 15 to 10 BCE. And furthermore, the same research as mentioned above has suggested that the Chalon-Sens segment in its entirety necessarily predates the city through which it traverses. Such a dating to the Chalon-Sens route, however, is at odds with the clear inflection that the route makes between Chalon and Salieu, or Roman Sidoculus, in order to reach Augustodunum. One would think, in other words, that the location of the road would have accommodated the pre-existing location of the city, not the other way around. Curiously enough, drawing an imaginary or direct route between the two cities falls right next to the location of the road segment that we will be looking at. Admittedly, the notion of a Roman road predating and thus by bypassing Autun is not new. This theory was originally proposed by Émile Thévenot in 1969, who recorded various traces of the route between Chalon-sur-Saône and Brazy-en-Morvan, at which point it rejoins with the road departing Autun. Curiously, however, this theory has remained largely overlooked in subsequent literature, even as the continuing archaeological research in Autun seems to increasingly corroborate it. Before addressing such scholarship, however, let's introduce some of the features of the segment at the core of this discussion. It's on this map marked by the green star. The road is located just north of the town of Nolay, located on the modern route between the modern cities of Beaune and Autun. Now part of a modern hiking path north of the village, it climbs and runs along the western cliff of the valley of the Kozan River. At the beginning of its about 86-meter ascent, running over approximately 587 meters, the path veers from its generally northward trajectory to approach the slope at an angle. While such a topographical feature alone is not enough to ascribe a Roman origin, approaching an incline at an angle to reduce the gradient of the path is a well-known hallmark of Roman road engineering. In fact, the lack of the path's linearity over the course of the climb may have been to maintain a relatively consistent gradient, which averaged around 15.8%. Such a slope is hardly an easy climb, but as will be addressed later, one that was clearly overcome. Over the duration of the climb, the remains of walls appear along either side of the path, typically made of loosely stacked stones. The western side, less consistently visible and or present, appears to have been functioned as a retaining wall. The eastern side appears to have been made more consistently extant, although certain portions appear to have been deliberately removed. It is difficult to determine at this stage how the construction of the walls, at least in their current form, relate to the construction of the road. If a retaining wall was or is necessary to prevent a landslide over the path, then surely the construction of the road must have been contemporaneously accompanied by such a feature. The eastern wall, however, largely resembles those demarcating property boundaries on local farms, a type of architecture that has likely changed little since well before the Roman period. It is in fact possible that the wall comprises of stones taken directly from a former Roman pavement, which will be discussed shortly, but further investigation of the walls is necessary before any substantial conclusions can be made about their origins. As we approach the top of the incline, the eastern wall disappears, and their western wall is replaced by the natural cliff face. At two locations, we see a conglomeration of seemingly intentionally upright placed stones, the latter group being substantially more preserved than the former, and exhibiting clear signs of wheel rut wearing. Despite the fact that I study ruts, I cannot pronounce those three words together, toward the upper right. To the left of the latter grouping, a large cavity is exposed in the cliff that resembles a small quarry. Emerging from the forest and reaching the top of the cliff, the path cuts directly into the exposed limestone bedrock, in which a profound single pair of wheel ruts very quickly appear. Generally, the easternmost rut is both narrower and deeper than the westernmost one, but their depth varies from around 10 to 20 centimeters. Intermittently visible for about 200 meters, they maintain a consistent gauge of just over 1.47 meters, and these ruts eventually fade away, and the bedrock itself becomes reburied as you continue to walk north past the property known as the Grange d'Etagny. Over the course of my own research, I have been increasingly confused by the regional scholarship's resistance to the notion that this road may have been part of the original Via Agrippa network, instead arguing, without any substantial evidence, that the road either predates the Roman conquest or more frequently that it dates to the late medieval period. I have encountered such opposition even in many locations, but the core of the issue can be summarized by the statement of a local historian in a publication from 2012. In reality, this route takes an itinerary of the High Middle Ages, mostly taken up after the decline of Augustodunum at the end of the 3rd century, but to which the best informed archaeologists do not hesitate to attribute an antique origin, given the density of Gallo-Roman sites around its course. Firstly, the statement's bizarre opposition to archaeological evidence as acceptable means of dating the road is perplexing. There is indeed at least a century and a half of scholarship documenting over 2,500 years of activity along the road between Chalon and Brazi, including several tumuli, as well as evidence of Roman occupation, including an apparent Gallo-Roman settlement adjacent to the segment we are looking at, as recorded in a survey in 1996. The larger issue, however, lies in the perpetuated assumption of Otun's 3rd century decline, which would have in turn encouraged travelers to seek faster routes between larger active cities. Although Augustodunum did gradually lose its significance as the center of Roman regional administration in late antiquity, the medieval attribution to the route seems rooted in outdated Edward Gibbon-esque preconceptions of the inevitable decay of Roman socioeconomic systems in the late antique West, and a cursory assessment of the historical and archaeological evidence highlight several faults in that line of reasoning. Although all of the late antique and early medieval itineraries identified in the region pass through Autun between Chalon and Sens, showing the continued importance of the city throughout the second half of the first millennia CE, at which point it was well known to have become a popular pilgrimage destination as the home of several Christian religious relics. The construction of its iconic cathedral by the end of the 12th century, itself the product of the extreme popularity of the relics it housed, which in fact had been transferred from a smaller and much older cathedral that was no longer able to accommodate the crowds of pilgrims, attests to the continuity between the end of Roman imperial rule in the late Middle Ages of a sufficient degree of activity within the city. Lastly, the recent excavations outside the city walls have now shown that the Temple of Janus, a Gallo-Roman temple erroneously named on account of the number of surviving facades, was converted into a fortification in the 10th to 11th centuries that was continuously occupied until the 15th century. It is in fact tentatively possible that this correction in the route is represented on the famous Tabula Peutingeriana, or Peutinger map. On this medieval itinerary of the Roman world, believed to be a copy of a 4th century original that itself likely drew from earlier sources, the route connecting Chalon, marked here as Cabione, to Autun, here labeled as Augudunum, heads downward before inexplicably making a sharp left, after which it traces back upwards to reach Salieu or Sidoculo. Admittedly, additions, revisions, and copyist imperfections make it nearly impossible to reconstruct the earliest iterations of the map with certainty, and the lack of any explicit legend makes it difficult to fully explain such cartographic anomalies, but one cannot help but consider the possibility that this feature may be in fact an attempt to denote the existence of a previous invisible route abandoned in favor of one that accommodated Autun. In any case, the rest of the archaeological evidence and archaeological and historical evidence discussed above decidedly point away to a medieval origin or medieval attribution to the route, allowing us to now seriously reconsider its Roman, if not earlier, construction. I have no doubt that the route incorporating Autun into the so-called Via Agrippa is also of Roman origin. However, it necessarily postdates the foundation of the city and serves as a correction of this route, more direct route between Chalon and Sens. In that light, we are left with 3 possible explanations of the road's foundation, none of which are necessarily mutually exclusive. 1, it was the original path of the Via Agrippa, but was corrected after the foundation of Augustodunum between 37 to 10 BCE. The route dates to Caesar's conquest, and Agrippa was behind both the foundation of Augustodunum and the correction of the road serving it. Or the route predates the Roman period, in other words, pre-58 BCE in the region. I am hesitant to attribute specific people, be it Caesar, Augustus, or Agrippa, to the road's creation, but I nonetheless would argue that the answer is likely a hybrid of at least 2 of the above possibilities. On the one hand, that it connects 2 major pre-Roman riverine ports, Chalon and Sens, would suggest it played a significant role in Gallic networks of communication and exchange. On the other hand, several physical characteristics of the road strongly suggest Roman-era renovations and improvements to the road. That the ruts measure, on average, less than a centimeter shy of exactly 5 Roman feet, or 1.48 meters, conforms to similar rut measurements on known Roman roads throughout Italy, France, and the UK, especially in military contexts. One poignant example is shown here, the Via Domitia in southern France, originally constructed around 100 BCE to serve the military camp of Ambrusum. The paving of the Via Domitia here notably also resembles the patches of stones on our own segment. The implications of this type of construction will be addressed later. As we have already discussed, the nature of its approach to the cliff resembles that of other known Roman roads. Lastly, the many archaeological finds found along the course of the route between Chalon and Brazi attest to a continued Roman presence. Establishing a Roman use, if not creation, of the road in question allows us to raise some important questions about Roman road construction. One of the most recognizable characteristics of this road segment, for instance, are indeed its deep ruts, but what arguably makes their presence so remarkable is not their conformity to 5 Roman feet, their depth, or their consistency, but rather their medium. Ancient roads cut directly into the bedrock are a frequent occurrence throughout Northern Europe, recognizable arguably only on account of the profound rutting they seem to have in common. For the Roman period, such a straightforward, although certainly not easy, approach to road building stands in stark contrast to the layers of sand, gravel, and paving that, even setting aside Bergier's rigid and obsolete models, continue to be seen as a hallmark of Roman road construction. Recent scholarship on antique road networks in Europe have tended to associate rutted roads with medieval activity, stemming from studies of several roads in Switzerland, such as the one shown here in Balag, which were ultimately identified as medieval routes for the import of salt into the country. Such a function, however, is very geographically limited, so whatever the causal relationship between the Swiss medieval salt trade and the formation of ruts on the road used, if such a correlation is indeed accurate, does not necessarily apply to rutted roads elsewhere in Europe. Furthermore, the gauges of those roads in Switzerland never exceeded 1.26 or 27 meters, a far cry from the 1.48 meters on the many known Roman roads. Outside of Switzerland, but still within Northern Europe, other decidedly Roman roads employ the same technique, suggesting that the phenomenon has a geographic rather than temporal correlation. Arguably the best example of such a road is along the Via delle Gallie, or Road of the Gauls, in the Aosta Valley in the Alps in northern Italy, near its border with France. In the extant remains of Roman cities, such as Ostia and Pompeii, urban street networks preserve a series of countless overlapping and discontinuous ruts, to the point that some streets have more rutting than untouched surface. In such contexts, the formation of ruts in the pavement were seen as a disruption to the flow of traffic, if not also a safety hazard to animals and vehicles, and they were constantly being repaired, either through the replacement of paving zones or through the use of iron slag to fill in portions of the ruts. In other words, the formation of ruts was an unwanted yet inevitable part of the natural cycle of urban vehicular movement. Vehicles became increasingly impeded by their own rutting until the surface was repaired or replaced. In interurban roads, however, the appearance and qualities of ruts seem to paint a very different picture. Regardless of their dating, rutting found running directly within bedrock are continuously more linear and continuous than their urban counterparts, and their frequently profound depths suggest that the bedrock was indeed the road's surface, collecting the iterative wear of traffic since the road's creation. Moreover, many of these roads, such as our own segment here, run surprisingly close to the edge of a cliff, so a deep and steady pair of ruts could have acted as a guide to keep vehicles away from the edge. In other words, the uniformity and topography of such roads suggests that the formation of ruts was both beneficial to drivers as well as intentional, which, combined with their appearance directly in the bedrock, implies a type of Roman road construction created through carving out rather than building up. Given the current dearth of research and comparative assessments of such road types, the exploration of the methods and motivations associated with their formation remains largely speculative, but allow us to pose important questions to direct future research. There is certainly precedent for a topographically destructive approach to road building, most famously near Terracina, and I just realized, I apologize, I forgot to include a photo of that. I will go back afterwards and pull one up. Famously near Terracina, Italy, where in 105 CE, under the direction of Trajan, an outcropping of a cliff was quite literally sliced away to more efficiently redirect the Via Appia to squeeze between the jagged terrain and the coastline. At various points along the path, the elevation of the road surface suddenly drops, if walking south, by a few centimeters. Similar features appear to be present in some of the medieval rutted roadways in Switzerland, where they seem to have provided level steps for the drivers or for draft animals to be able to stop without needing to worry about the vehicle and gravity. Here, however, the steps are far less uniform, flat and regular, suggesting that it may have simply been the result of a staggered approach to the quarrying away and smoothing of the bedrock. It is in fact possible that the ruts confirm this. The easternmost rut tend to be both slightly deeper, narrower, and more well-defined than the westernmost rut, presenting the possibility that this rut was originally the vestigial trench of a pre-cut guide for extracting the rest of the rock. It does indeed somewhat resemble such trenches found at known Roman quarry sites, such as the one shown on the right here from Sagalos, Turkey. Incoming vehicles would have then adopted the trench as a guide along the cliff's edge, not only deepening it over time, but also subsequently forming a second rut with the opposing wheel, whose increased gauge or whose increased width reflects potential variability in axle gauges. Such a hypothesis might seem to undermine the notion of the intentional placement of the ruts, but this is not necessarily the case. Given the precarious terrain the road traverses, its engineers may have placed their quarrying trench to also serve as a guiding track. This would be especially logical if there was an immediate need by the constructors to, for instance, transport several vehicles now laden with heavy stones extracted from the bedrock. Regardless of the precise method of extraction, the construction of this road would have generated, as opposed to required, as was the case with its paved counterparts, large quantities of stone. Perhaps, in addition to potential logistical and/or engineering benefits, laying the route directly in the bedrock would have also been seen as a means to produce building material. If this is the case, one can only speculate at this stage, at least, the full nature and extent of this micro-operation. Was, for instance, this a military endeavor solely to clear the road and supply material for construction works, or are we seeing the result of local civilian organization providing nearby settlements with new materials while also upkeeping the nearby roadway? Nonetheless, other features of and along the roadway provide potentially relevant clues. The adjacent quarry, if it is indeed a quarry, could represent a continuity of extraction after the road was fully cleared. These locations may have also been the source of the stones for the walls lining much of the ascent of the path. More research, however, is needed to properly date these structures, as well as the quarry, for that matter. The same can be said of the seemingly intentionally placed patches of stones that are found toward the end of the route's ascension. Speaking of, these stones, seemingly pitched upright into the soil, are equally curious of a characteristic, namely due to the scholarly contention, or more accurately, confusion, regarding their role in road layout in Roman Gaul. As early as the 1930s, French archaeologists such as Albert Plenier documented the presence of a stone layer called an hérison, literally meaning hedgehog, on identified Roman road segments. And even Émile Thévenot records some further north on the Chalon-Sens route, although makes no mention of the ones here. Such a technique, in which a raft, or apparently hedgehog, presumably in reference to the animal's quills, of stones are placed in the ground on edge and covered by a layer of sand, clay, and/or small gravel, is a frequently documented feature of Gallo-Roman roads. Some scholarships suggest that the design facilitated drainage, although I have not found any studies explaining how or why this was the case. There seems, however, to be no scholarly consensus or standard on how thick that covering layer needs to be for stones to qualify as a hedgehog as opposed to pavers. In some research and archaeological reports, the term is clearly used to refer to a deeply covered and buried foundational layer, whereas elsewhere, the stones appear covered by only a thin layer of sand and gravel, likely for tractional purposes and to fill in the crevices. Indeed, much of the problem here is arguably semantic, but it is worth exploring due to the consequent roadblocks, so to speak, in researching and comparing Roman road surfaces, especially in Gaul, and it is furthermore important to understand what layer of road these stones back in Nolay actually represent. The Via Domitia in Imbrusum, for instance, exhibits several upright placed pavers, and it is clear that they are on the surface of the road on account of the ruts and their evenness with the enclosing curbstones. although it is possible that a sufficiently thin layer of covering gravel or sand could have simply washed away. The same could very well have been the case with the segment near Nolay, given the presence of the rut in the upper right side, but no nearby curbstones are currently visible or have been found, although some may be visible closer to the bottom of the slope. I should also point out that sketches of a Roman road segment near Pontypool, Wales, by John Ward in 1911 depict a very similar feature, but I have been unable to find any other reference to this stretch of road. In fact, if anybody here happens to be familiar with the site, I would love maybe to chat later on. But anyway, on the other hand, several recently examined Gallo-Roman roads contain hérison buried by several centimeters. And given the slope of the terrain in our case, it is entirely possible that this upper layer of sand could have eroded away very quickly, and eventually wheels were wearing directly into what was intended to be a substratum. Unfortunately, given the poor state of what is currently visible, an additional survey and actual excavation might be necessary in order to uncover additional evidence of the road surface or its lower layers. Oops. Okay. The most important motivation behind understanding the true nature of the supposed hérison, however, lies in its eventual replacement by the bedrock at the top of the cliff. Roman roads have traditionally been recognized and on occasion praised for their uniformity and regularity. Putting aside the misinformed remarks about how modern pothole-ridden highways pale in comparison to the perfection and longevity of Roman paving, a quick glance back at the road from Pompeii summarily dismantles that argument. Such claims arguably do injustice to the flexibility of the engineers to adapt to the topography. That the shift from the hérison technique to cutting directly into the bedrock directly coincides with the leveling of the terrain makes an extremely important, yet crucially under-acknowledged statement about Roman road construction. Firstly, this reveals a more dynamic approach to construction than is attested by most surviving instances of Roman road surfaces. Moreover, the change in road design potentially speaks to their underlying engineering function. Perhaps an hérison layout, when coated with only a thin layer of sand or gravel, may have provided a greater degree of traction on sloped paths. Indeed, the Via Domitia in Ambrusum, too, has a noticeable gradient, but not nearly as steep as here. Experimental research may be required to determine if and how such a surface may have helped control the movement of wheeled traffic. This brings us to our last point. More so than any of its other features, the gradient of the path's incline provides us with a decisive answers to ongoing debates. Although it averages just under 16%, for a number of short bursts, the slope of the route exceeds 25 to 30%. And yet, the deep ruts running along the top of the cliff confidently attest to the ability, one way or another, for vehicles to successfully climb and presumably descend the steep route. In recent studies of other important ancient routes, such as the military way along Hadrian's Wall, such steep gradients have been considered as a possible limiting factor for the passage and use of vehicles. But the juxtaposition of the slope and wheel ruts here make it clear that the navigation of such seemingly insurmountable terrain was indeed achievable. By extension, then, the vehicles traversing such slopes would have needed to make use of some form of braking system, although very little is currently known about such technology during the Roman period. Several stone reliefs, as well as one mosaic from Roman Gaul, depict four-wheeled wagons with some sort of mechanism hanging between their axles. It is unknown whether such a device was in fact some sort of wheel jam, or wheel jam, as has been considered. As has been proposed in previous literature, but it is certainly worth noting the geotemporal coincidence of such depictions with the region in which these roads appear. To that end, it may very well be that the technological expectations and capabilities of vehicles may have varied regionally, but continued investigation in the forms and functions of ancient land sport will be necessary in order to flesh out these kinds of patterns. I will concede in conclusion that this is the type of discussion that ultimately raises more questions than answers. Even if the road dates to the Roman period, how long was it in use? Why was it eventually abandoned? Who were the agents of its construction and possibly upkeep? What kind of technology must have facilitated the successful traversal of the steep terrain? How do all of the observed features along the route, from its walls to its hedgehogs to its ruts, relate to one another temporally, if at all? But the ability to ask such questions merely reflects the archaeologically rich history of just the small road segment and its importance to former inhabitants or travelers across the local landscape. Ultimately, future exploration and comparative assessments will further highlight the dynamic and complex web of social, economic, and/or military practices that underlie the construction and form of such roadways that would surely enrich a variety of other subdisciplines in the study of and beyond the Roman world. As a final note, I would like to point out that I am tentatively hopeful to return to the site this summer, and I hope to be able to recapture some better quality images, and more importantly, finally get some aerial photography with my drone that has been patiently itching for some archaeological action. I will be sure to keep the Triple RA updated on this venture. And with that, thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Thank you, David. And if you could stop your screen share now.
Yes, I'm trying to figure that out. I lost the button. Oh, there it is. Got it.
Excellent, right. Well, thank you for that. You've been talking particularly about roads that we're not so familiar with in the UK, in that you've got roads which are cut into the bedrock.
Right.
We probably have some examples of that here, but you've been looking at a large number. I've got a question from Elizabeth Ship, who's saying regarding interurban roads that are cut into the bedrock, would that, in your view, indicate that the roads are more likely Roman co-options of other existing roads or routes? You mentioned early on that some of them might be earlier Gallic routes before the Romans got there. I wonder, is there any evidence either way, and are bedrock roads any more or less likely to be?
Well, what I can say in terms of that is because you have a lot of the ones in Switzerland that are being dated to the medieval period, what I think we might be seeing is, rather than a road, these bedrock roads being dated temporally, it's more of a product of the region that they're in. So the fact, for example, that you see less of them in Britain or in Italy or in central and southern Italy might be that this might have been a technique started during the Gallic period that continued on throughout the Roman and later medieval periods. In terms of beyond that, in terms of features that specifically would attest to a pre-Roman or Celtic presence, I have kind of, again, tentatively explored potential to see if there's any correlation between rut measurements. I have unfortunately yet had the chance to collect a sufficient number of only Celtic roads with ruts to make that determination, mostly because most of those roads ended up becoming Roman. So that is something that I will have to keep pursuing, but it's a great point and a good question.
The chat is open for questions, should say to everyone, so that if you have more questions to ask of David, do send them in, please.
Right. What I'm going to do is pull up a photo of that sliced off cliff on the Via Appia, because I did mean to put that in the presentation, and it did not make its way there. I do see somebody asking, am I supposed to be seeing the questions, or?
You can, by and large, I'll put the questions to you so that we just,
okay,
they come in
sure,
some sort of order. But yes, I saw we got a question that did come in there. You mentioned earlier as well that you disputed what some people had said about them being either pre-Roman or post-Roman, and you were suggesting they were Roman. Would you like to just explain a little bit what is your thinking that argues that these are Roman, in fact?
Right. So the problem with answering that question head on is I wasn't really clear about their argument about why it was medieval. They kind of just said it was and moved on. And like, for example, there was that one quote, it's like, despite all the archaeological evidence, or this is clearly a medieval road, despite the fact that all these archaeologists are pointing out all the Roman stuff we're finding, but still it's clearly not a Roman road. And I read that and I'm like, I didn't quite follow the logic. So I guess I would say, in a very simplistic sense, I'm looking at just, so the fact, I don't know if that's kind of answering your question, that the problem is largely the fact that I don't quite understand their reasoning as to why it's medieval. And then I just, as looked at the evidence, I'm like, all right, so they make this claim, I'm looking at all this evidence. There's evidence of Roman occupation near the site. There's the rutting matches 5 Roman feet. The road has some decidedly Roman characteristics. This seems Roman to me.
Yeah, absolutely. A follow-up question from Elizabeth was that, she said, my mind boggles at the depth of some of the ruts.
Yes.
What do you do about bidirectional traffic? It seems to have been impossible once a vehicle is in the ruts. No one can use the same set of ruts in the same direction. Some of those roads seem very narrow. Would there have been passing?
So there was, again, I don't know if this, but I will say that there was further along down the road, a little bit after the ruts disappear, there was kind of like this, I don't know how to describe it, but this like area, now it's just a large area of like grass that
passing place.
That could have been a passing place. Again, there's, we can only speculate because there's nothing specifically archaeological to say about it. But at the very least, looking at it now, it seems that could have been a potential solution.
Right. I've got lots of people asking about your ruts. From Kevin Scott. Am I being naive? But did Romans have these measured widths of wheel ruts before they conquered countries? Amazing. Did they have their wheel ruts measured as part of their conquest strategy?
That's a good question. I don't think it was necessarily part of a military tactic or part of their specific plans. It's more, it probably just comes down to like just a standardized way of producing vehicles, and then those vehicles would have been picked up by the military, and that kind of would like a kind of a chain effect that would have then made its way directly onto the roads we're looking at. And that said, if you're arguing about the intentionality of ruts, that implies that the Romans themselves would have acknowledged, all right, our vehicles tend to have this gauge. If we're going to make a road with ruts, we need to make it the same gauge. Otherwise, we're going to have a lot of tilting carts.
Yeah, and that one from Robin Taylor here is a very similar sort of question. You've mentioned the gauges of ruts a number of times. Did different countries have different gauge standards for wagons and carts? Do you find the same width everywhere in the Roman Empire?
Absolutely not. In fact, what was one of the most interesting discoveries of my, it is a great question, interesting discoveries of my my master's thesis was that the one place where I would have expected, the one place with the most amount of ruts to measure, Pompeii, was the place where there were the least amount of ruts percentage-wise adhering to this Roman gauge. And as it turns out, it looks like well over half of them were actually abiding by the gauge of the original the metric system used by the original inhabitants of the city, the Oskans. And 5 Roman feet, again, is 1.48 meters, but 5 Oscan feet is 1.375 meters. And a majority of the wheel ruts that I measured much more closely approximate that than they do in the Roman one. In fact, and here's where it gets confusing, and this is where my research gets interesting. If I could actually, well, actually, I don't need to say, if any of you saw the photo, the profile photo that came with the announcement of this presentation, I'm standing in front of a vehicle. That vehicle is actually from a site not too far from Pompeii. And when that photo was taken, I measured the ruts of that, or not the ruts, the actual gauge of that vehicle between the tires, and it was exactly 5 Oscan feet. But where it gets interesting is that kind of vehicle looks exactly the same as the type of vehicle that I just showed you in that second to last slide in my presentation. So which means you have the same vehicle types that are being made to different gauges in different regions.
It wasn't just urban vehicles as against Pompeii compared with heavier vehicles to transport between towns.
Right. Yeah, there might have been a correlation between different types of carts and whether, like, so if it was like a big kind of cart for carrying lumber or say stone, it might have been bigger. But that was actually the original question I approached my master's thesis with. But there's not enough. There's really no evidence that I found at the moment that really allows us to associate a specific gauge to a specific type of cart.
There's a question from Philip Schuckman, which I know relates to something you mentioned perhaps in your itinerary article.
Okay.
Would the ruts have been initially inserted into the bedrock to offer a certain amount of stability and then grown deeper through use? Could they have been put there deliberately?
Absolutely. So what I'm thinking happened in this road is one of them was inserted deliberately. And this, as a result of the potential cutting away of the road, but placed in such a way as to acknowledge that a wheel would then eventually pass through it. And this is why, and then over time, that one got deeper, but then another one on the adjacent side also formed. And that's why if you looked at some of the images, or if you go there, you'll see one of them consistently looks deeper than the other. All right, if I could, before you keep going, just share my screen for one more second. I can't find the best images of it, but I do want to show some of this road, or this thing. It's a modern road now, but you'll see where they cut off the cliff. Because I do apologize for not including that in my presentation. Let's see how quickly that, no, we're just gonna go back here. Open image, there we go. Well, that's disappointing. And you can see it's a little blurry, but you can see that this cliff was just cut straight down. This is in southern Italy. And there's actually Roman carvings marking how many feet they cut down, like progressively. So they'll be like, it'll have an X here, and then it'll have 2 X's here. And then at the bottom, it's like you have an L, just showing how many feet that they went down. And it's quite impressive. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted to make sure I showed that.
Yes, thank you.
Let me turn off the sharing. There we go.
Right, I've got another question here. And this is from Penny in, first of all, Paul Baker, any experimental archaeology or evidence as to the natural rate of formation of ruts? Do we know how long it took for ruts to form?
Unfortunately, we don't. What I do know is that there haven't been any experimental archaeology, although I certainly agree it needs to be done. Certain articles, research by Eric Paler, has talked about how different types of paving would have more or less quickly succumbed to a greater accumulation of ruts. Specifically at Pompeii, you kind of have a random placement. However you can get the stones to fit together is how they fit together. But in a number of cities in North Africa and the Near East, you have the placement of square pavers diagonally with respect to the direction of the street, and that appears to have had a better effect at regulating the accumulation of ruts. That said, when it comes to bedrock, I think the greatest factor is obviously going to be the material of the rock, because presumably the tires were consistently iron. So that's really not the variable here. It's more so the material, and I can say this is limestone, so one of the softer types of rocks. So maybe not that long of a time, and especially if these carts were, at least at the beginning, were carrying lots of heavy stone that had just come from the cliff. So, but no, it's an excellent point, and I'm in absolute agreement that some experimental archaeology needs to be done.
Right, and we've got a question here from our own Mike Aiken, who is asking, has anyone carried out a thorough study of wheel gauges and rut width to ascertain whether or not the 5 per days gauge continued in use in some parts of Europe during the medieval period, or even later? I know some people argue about steam engines being using the old Roman gauge.
Right. So I'll address that myth first, because this is kind of what got me into it. As it turns out, so the engine gauge, and I believe it's the same in the US as it is in the UK, it's 5 American feet, 8.5 inches, I believe. And as it turns out, that myth sprung from the fact that this gauge appears to be very close to the gauge of some of the ruts in Pompeii, and somebody must have made a connection at some point. This is the Roman gauge. This must be where it came from. The problem with that, as I discovered in my master's thesis, is that the gauge that they were seeing in Pompeii wasn't Roman. But as to Mike's original question, it looks like a lot of the ruts on those medieval bedrock roads were much smaller, like 1.1 to 1.2 meters. There hasn't, however, been any specific study about how these things changed over time, at what point certain settlements throughout the late Roman landscape might have stopped using traditional systems of measurement in their various products manufacture. There have really just only been kind of acknowledgements, often unsubstantiated, that the gauges of medieval vehicles were smaller. But no, not yet, Mike. There haven't been any kind of graduated assessments over time.
Right, thank you. And then I've got one from Penny in Barrow here. I don't believe roads like this have been found in the UK at all. Correct me if I'm wrong. But should we be looking for any non-standard road construction methods, especially in rocky areas, which might be inspired by this? Could we have missed routes while we've been looking for the classic agger? Any thoughts? So
I will, for the most part, I will actually defer to you guys in terms of looking at instances in Britain. I believe actually Dave Armstrong had sent me an article a while back showing some, I forget exactly where they were, some potential candidates of routes that had ruts or some kind of trenches in the bedrock. But they weren't necessarily Roman. But yeah, no, that is a good point. A lot of people might have been in looking for roads. If they saw bedrock, they might have assumed that if there had been a road here, it might have worn away. I must confess that when the way I got into Roman roads was very much as a result of this. So my familiarity with the surviving evidence of roads actually within Britain might be a bit less than many of yours. But suffice to say, I myself am not really aware of any definitive instances of roads cut into the bedrock from Roman Britain.
Right, thank you. And now we'll go on from Robin Taylor. I think you've already answered, saying, is there any established relationship between ancient or medieval gauges and modern rail gauges? But you dealt with that.
Right.
Yeah. You say it's a myth.
Yes.
And from Penny in Barrow again, could the braided tracks pattern we see in softer ground in the UK be related? I'm not quite sure what I understand by that. The braided tracks is where the routes are spread out in several directions over softer ground. I suppose you can get ruts, but they would not stay, presumably.
Right. Yeah, if it's in softer. Yeah, I mean, I actually did hear about one excavation here in the US a few years ago where they were excavating a dirt roadway, and they actually found kind of the footprint in a sense of a colonial era footprint of vehicle tracks, but I don't know if anything similar has been documented in salvage archaeological or commercial archaeological excavations in the UK. I will say though, and I think I talk about this actually in my itinerant article, I do get sometimes frustrated when certain excavations will say, oh, look, we found a rut, and they will give me like the depth of the rut, its location in the road, and then they won't record its gauge at all. And it drives me crazy, but yeah, so it's entirely possible that those have just been found and not recorded.
Well, we've still got more questions here.
I'm happy to answer them.
On. Yeah. This is an interesting one. Any evidence at all, including literature, this is from Philip Beaven, that awkward or deep ruts could have been filled by cut wood, perhaps providing traction for some years, the non-standard wagon gauge. Don't know how you'd even demonstrate that.
No, not wood. In Pompeii, again, more recent research by Dr. Eric Paler has showed that toward the later years of the city's history, prior to the eruption of the volcano, they were actually repairing the roads rather than by replacing the entire paving stones, but filling some of the ruts up with molten slag. So that's close to what you're saying, but
molten slag.
Melted slag. Sorry.
Oh yeah. Does it been used for ironwork?
Yeah. So they were using kind of waste to just fill in the worn parts of the roadways rather than replacing them fully. And so it's entirely possible that other places could have used wood, which would have certainly been easier. But because wood isn't preserved, we don't have any evidence for that. I will say, in terms of ancient literature reference to ruts, we do know the term that they used to refer to ruts. It was orbita, is the Latin word, and that's where we actually get our modern word orbit. But I haven't actually had a chance to look at how they talk about ruts in ancient literature, but I do not think they talk about repairing them in any way.
Right, thank you. And John Wall has just put in one of the questions, the statement, I think, the 4 foot 8.5 inch gauge came from the Stevensons, yeah, which is more or less what you said, but it certainly wasn't from the Romans. There's a question here from Nigel Rothwell. Could the ruts in the bedrock on inclines be for sledges rather than wheeled vehicles?
Yes, that is possible. I don't know of any evidence of sledges in this area in the Roman period. I know the place I am most familiar with the use of sledges, in the Mediterranean, well, in the Mediterranean at least, are the ruts, associated with ruts rather, are the Isle of Malta, where it is almost very famously, the island is covered with ruts that are thousands of years old, that are clearly and they just overlap and they're all over the island, and I would love to see them at some point, where they are clearly the result of just sledges, not wheels. And I don't know the exact reasoning why, but I know a lot of research has been done on that, and that they are sledges. I don't think that the ones here would have been sledges, but I suppose it is possible.
We've got a note from Bev, that will be Bev Not, saying that he believes that there is a section of road in the UK cut into bedrock in North Bristol.
Oh,
but
okay.
He's going to check that one out.
Excellent, thank you.
You inspired him to check it out.
Great.
From G. Nixon, a single cut rut would permit various gauges to be used on the same route.
Right.
Might gauge standardization have been a later development in the Roman period?
Well, it's possible. I think when we talk about gauge standardization, we're not looking at the larger pattern. It's not so much that gauges themselves were standardized as it was as a practice of a more generalized practice of having a standardized measurement for the manufacture or building of any number of things, of which vehicles were just a part. Like including, I think, more famously, architecture. Just the things would have been built to a specific number of feet, and that kind of just, I guess, spilled its way into the production of vehicles as well. So it's not so much that there was an idea at one point to standardize vehicles, specifically vehicles to a certain gauge. That was more of the byproduct of kind of just keeping things simple in how products are made.
Right, and finally we've got one from Mike Anton here, though it's more of an observation really, and I'm not quite sure what you're going to be able to do with it. I've been looking at David's section on, and he gives the reference topographicmap.com and Google Maps, and he can't work out why that route section went up this hill. Do you understand that?
If he's asking in terms of why it chose to go up the hill as opposed to another route, I think it has to do with, like, I'll see if I can, let me see something. Let me see if I can go back to the topographic. Let me do one thing. I might, IGN, all right. Oops. Sorry, I'm just going to pull up a map of my own just so I can address the question at the same time. There we go. All right, I'm going to share my screen again. There we go. Share screen. All right. Oop. So, yes. Ooh, that's not the right place. Find it. There it is. No, where is Nolay? There it is. Okay. Right. So the road, this portion that we're talking about is right here. I believe everyone can see my mouse. It looks like, so my reasoning was, I mean, so what is there currently is a modern hiking path, and that's kind of what the road is used for today. And it very much looks like, in terms of making its way to Sens from Chalon, or Sallier rather, it would have either had to go around this cliff, or rather it would have had to go on this side of the this cliff or on this side. And if you zoom in, it's clear that the ascent ends up being just as difficult either way. And so I guess I can't really say why it ended up going around this way instead of this way, but as to why it went up the cliff in the way it did, I think again it was to mitigate the steepness of the gradient as much as possible. And because once it reaches the top of it, it's a very, very flat path until around here, and it'd be very easy to traverse. So it might have been getting the difficult part out of the way sooner.
Yeah, Mike Anton got back and said, yeah, just not knowing the wider context of the area, it looked a bit odd to him as a route. But
okay.
I think it was as good as any other, basically. Yeah. And I think we're almost there in terms of questions. I just wanted to ask you myself, in view of the fact that, you know, we normally think of agas as representing Roman roads, is there any evidence at all that they could have been gravel or some kind of metaling or surfacing put on the bedrock that had just been lost over the years? Because if that had been lost, the ruts could be medieval, post-Roman.
Yeah, absolutely. That is possible. So again, especially because it's on the edge of the cliff, that kind of material could have easily washed away. What inclined me to consider that this is very likely Roman is the fact that we have that one instance, the Via delle Gallie in northern Italy in the Alps, that goes under a Roman arch, is cut into the bedrock and has ruts running through it. And like, so everything about that is Roman, which kind of sets the precedent for the fact that other roads during the Roman period could go through the bedrock. Justice. So again, yes, it is theoretically possible, but it is certainly at least possible to say that this is something that the Romans could do or would do, and in fact have done on occasion.
Well, I've got a couple of things here from people saying, great presentation, thank you. That's from Ray, and from Paul Baker, really great lecture and discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks. And after you give the lecture, it's always very welcome to hear from you.
Yes, this is actually the first time I'm doing something like this, so I was very happy to take it up, and I hope that it was long enough and enjoyed enough in light of, I believe, Mike Bishop's original.
Well, we still got 49 people with us, I think.
That's great. Yeah, all right.
So well done. And I just want to, I want to thank all the team who made this possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who hosted it and been feeding your questions through to me and so on. And of course, thanking all the people who've actually logged on to listen to us. But most of all to you, David, for putting this on at what's been a very busy time for you and sharing the subject of your studies.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I very much enjoyed it, even last minute. So I'm glad I could help. I'm glad it was enjoyed. I'm glad, period.
Lots of thank yous coming in. I won't read them all, but lots of thank yous.
Yes, I do see them.
Good. Okay, well, that's the end of the evening, everyone. Appreciate you joining us, and until next time, when hopefully we'll have Mike back in the chair. Goodbye to you all. Goodbye.